There's a major reform happening in Australian psychology training right now. You've probably already heard the sales pitch. Shorter pathway, more practical training, more psychologists in the workforce. And look, parts of that are genuinely needed. But there's something really important right now that's missing from the conversation. Because the real issue isn't that we lack placements, it's that we lack placements at the price the current system wants to pay. And once you see that, this whole reform looks very different. It's not so much reform to the training pathway for psychologists as it is a review of the value of psychologists and the value of supervision. Let's start with the basics. The proposal is a move to a 5-year professional degree. Earlier practical training, a single streamlined pathway, more graduates, faster. By the way, that part's hard to argue. How much of undergrad was chewed up with largely irrelevant filler material? And despite how much we talk about excellence in science and methodology, psychologists are just as starry-eyed about new, unproven techniques as ever. So you're not going to find me saying a bad word about more real-world training sooner. It also lets people decide if they don't want to be psychologists. Once you've had a placement or two in second year, you don't have the same investment as you do by the time you finished a master's. But the framing of the current reform is around solving a bottleneck. We don't have enough placements and we don't have enough supervisors. That line gets repeated a lot, both in public and in the document itself. But it's actually not true. Around 30% of registered psychologists are board-approved supervisors. Just think about that for a second. Almost 1 in 3 psychologists are board-approved supervisors. So why can't we find anybody to supervise placements? We do have placements. We've got experienced psychologists. They're in private practice, they're in the public sector, they're in communities, they're in schools, they're in NGOs. They are people who are capable of supervising, and they are willing, and they've got the skills, and they're approved. What we don't have is a system that pays them properly to do it. Supervision is time intensive. It carries risk, and as a clinician, it pulls you away from billable work. And right now, the business case just doesn't stack up. Let's think about an example. Most universities pay their supervisors well under $100 per hour to supervise, and then they struggle to find qualified people to meet the demand of their placements. Now, in the registrar training program that I run, we pay substantially more than that to our supervisors, and we don't struggle to find them. In fact, we have a team of highly qualified, experienced supervisors. So the problem is not about capacity. It's about the value of the work. The work supervisors do is not valued, so they don't do it. The placements didn't disappear. They just didn't show up inside the system that needs them. Now, instead of fixing that pricing problem, these reforms try to get around it. And the way they do is clever. What they're trying to do is to build placement capacity inside government-funded services, inside NGO contracts, and inside these large-scale public mental health initiatives. So if the market's not going to provide placements at the price we want to pay for it, we will create a system that can do it for us. Now, we need to think about this because placements aren't just educational experiences. They're actually embedded inside the service delivery system. Right now, most of those systems are in the private sector. The supervision to work, it's got to be billable at a decent rate. The plan going forward is that these placements will be provided inside government care centres like Head to Help, Mental Health Checkup, Headspace, etc., etc. Now, theoretically, that should be great. The government can afford to run mental health services that are a bit less lean than a little mum and dad operation running a private practice, so therefore they can afford to take on the burden of training. But of course they won't. The federal government doesn't deliver services, and they don't trust the states with any more money. What they're going to do, the government will tender this work out, and it'll be taken on by a dozen large not-for-profits. First thing they're going to do is take a 40% clip off the top to cover their operating expenses. And then they will partner with a bunch of smaller agencies to deliver a cost-effective system. It's fascinating. While one branch of the health department is busy dismantling the NDIS, this arm is busy building a new one. A massive behemoth that moves money around, funds the not-for-profit sector, and lets the federal government wash their hands of blame by delivering the cheapest possible care to those who need it. So the question becomes, what kind of clinical experiences are cheapest to scale? And the answer is obvious. Brief intervention, triage, protocol-delivered care, low-risk presentations. Again, all of that is useful and all of it is needed and all of it is exactly what the government should be doing their time. But what then happens if that becomes the bulk of your training experience? Over time, that becomes the profession. Now, let's layer in the psychology assistant pathway, which we haven't talked about yet. On paper, it makes sense. We're going to have these psychology assistants who are going to come out job ready. They can support psychologists, they're going to increase access, and they're going to create a workforce pipeline to do a lot of the work that psychologists often find they aren't in a position to do. But in a cost-constrained system, it's going to do something else. It's going to produce a cheaper substitute workforce. We're worried about the two-tier system we have now between clinical psychologists and registered psychologists. In the future, we're going to have tier 1 as registered psychologists. They're going to be more expensive. They're going to be used for complexity, oversight, and taking on liability and risk. Then we're going to have a second tier of psychology assistants who are going to be cheap, scalable, doing high volume, low intensity work. Here's the question that I haven't seen anybody asking directly. If the system is being designed around cost efficiency, why would you continue to rely on the more expensive tier? Not because anyone wants to devalue psychologists, but the system that we are building is going to optimize cost. That's what it's built to do. So while this just looks like a training reform, I think we need to think about the second order and the third order consequences. It's actually a structural shift. We're going to move from a profession that's defined by depth, judgment, training intensity, to a workforce model that is designed for scalability, delegation, and cost control. And again, it's not stated explicitly, but that's where the incentives of this structure will lead. Remember, every system is perfectly designed to achieve the outcomes that it achieves. If this is going to work without hollowing things out, we're going to need to see some real safeguards, not vague reassurances. First off, you've got to build in paying the market rate for supervision. If you want to see high quality placements, they've got to be funded properly, especially in private and complex settings. Otherwise, you're just going to select the cheapest environments and the least experienced supervisors. If you want quality, you've got to pay for it. Secondly, there's got to be some kind of mandate in the training for clinical complexity. Trainees are going to have to demonstrate sustained therapy work, complex case management, and independent formulation under supervision, not just delivering a whole bunch of manualised care within a large government system. There's going to have to be some hard limits on what psychology assistants can actually do. We're going to need to define their scope. What can they do? What can't they do? Do they always have to sit with a psychologist? Do they have to be overseen by a psychologist? Because if we don't draw that line, the government is going to be pushing for them to work at the top of their scope in no time. And if we don't define what their scope is, it's going to be drawn by funding pressures. Next, we're going to have to separate the training from service economics. If placements are going to be embedded in funding services, we're going to have to figure out a way to protect trainees from pressure on KPIs, service quotas, and cost cutting. Otherwise, the students are just becoming a workforce input, not a trainee. Number 5, supervisor viability. We need to treat supervision as a professional activity worth funding. No longer can it just be an add-on or goodwill that you contribute because of some sense of duty towards the profession. Because while we rely on goodwill and duty, I think since COVID, we're all out of goodwill. Finally, accreditation. Right now, most of the training experience for psychologists is being delivered by the universities. Now, we don't trust the universities because they are private providers. We don't trust them to not cut corners. So we have APAC, and APAC oversees the quality and the consistency of the training being delivered by the universities. Where are the accreditation standards for these new training centres? If the profession is going to come on behind these reforms, we're going to need to see these safeguards built in, not invented down the track. These reforms are trying to solve a real problem, but they're solving them in a very particular way, not by fixing the underlying economics, but by trying to redesign the system to avoid those economics. And that leads to a really different question entirely. It's not just how do we train more psychologists? It becomes more, what kind of system will they be trained inside? And ultimately, will that system still need them once we finish training them?